بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Alhamdulillah, is a continuation of our Seerah program of Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And Alhamdulillah, for us to understand the Seerah of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is in fact understanding the deen of Allah Subhanahu Wa Ta'ala. We're blessed today that we have with us Sheikh Idris, Alhamdulillah, who himself, mashallah, is a revert to the deen of Islam, a convert to Jewish, mashallah. And he accepted Islam in 1998 after studying Arabic at Leeds University, gaining a first, and thereafter continued on to the blessed city of Fez in the Maghrib, in which he spent more than 7 years studying the sacred sciences. Alhamdulillah, we are blessed that we have his presence with us today, inshallah ta'ala. And if there are any sisters present upstairs, they are more than welcome to come to the main prayer room downstairs, inshallah ta'ala. At the real prayer room.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد صلاة تخرجنا بها من أوحال الوهم وتوضحنا ما أشكل حتى يفهم إنك تعلم ولا نعلم وأنت علام الغيوب. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Assalamu alaikum to you all. Alhamdulillah, so we are looking now in this episode of the Seerah at the Battle of the Trench. And so the first question regarding the Battle of the Trench is, when did it actually happen? Because there's a bit of a debate about the actual event itself and when it happened. And so some of the opinion that it happened in the 4th year, and some are of the opinion that it happened in the 5th year. And the 5th year is the strongest opinion, because we have certain hadith, for example, of Abdullah ibn Umar, mentioning that on the day of Uhud, I was 14, but when I was, on the day of Uhud I was 14, but I was not allowed to participate at the trench, but I was not allowed to participate, but at the trench, he was 15. So this is actually the opinion, of the 4th year, because if we think of Uhud, when did Uhud occur? Which year? Well, that's you're going to get it tonight. Second year. Second year. So if you say 1 year after that, then we're sorry. So if we're saying Uhud second year, Uhud was 3rd year.
Second year was.
So if we're saying, you're testing me now. If we're saying the third year was Uhud. And he said after a year after that, I was allowed to participate at the Battle of the Trench. We're saying that Abdullah ibn Umar was how old? 14. We're talking 1 year afterwards. So we're saying that it occurred in the actual 4th year. And that's the opinion of Zuhri and Bukhari. They actually had this opinion that it happened in the 4th year. But the majority of the scholars actually had the opinion that it happened in the 5th year. And this is the most common position, that it happened in the 5th year. And I think in the last episode, you were talking about Bani Mustalaq, weren't you? And so after Bani Mustalaq, and now we're in the 5th year of the Prophet ﷺ's life. In this year, the 5th year, there wasn't actually many, the Prophet ﷺ himself did not travel much. There was very little travel, which was quite uncommon, because we see in the previous years, they were going out, participating in a number of expeditions. But now, this year was quite quiet. And if you think about it, what's happened so far in the Seerah? We've got the Battle of Badr, and then we've got the Battle of Uhud, and then a year after the Battle of Uhud, what do we have? We have the Battle of the second Badr, basically, where there was this challenge between the Quraysh and the Muslims that they have to have a second bout, a second round. And this is really important, this event, because the Muslims, they were prepared to go and meet the Quraysh, but the Quraysh, they weren't prepared to meet them for specific circumstances, because of the Quraysh, they were really suffering, because you've got to understand it strategically now, the Muslims, they hold the caravan routes for the Quraysh, and for the Quraysh, that's everything, the caravan routes. The Quraysh themselves, they weren't farmers, and so now, these many years now, the Muslims actually now dominating the traffic route, the caravan routes. They're really struggling. and there's talks of famine in Mecca and so forth. And so this really impedes the Quraysh from actually going out to fight, saying we've had such a difficult year and we're not going to be able to face them. But in order to save face, what do? This is going to become really significant for the Battle of the Trench. The Abu Sufyan, he contacts a man from the tribe of Ghatafan, and his name was Nu'aym ibn Mas'ud, to the best of my knowledge, if my memory serves me correctly. It was Nu'aym, I think. Nu'aym ibn Mas'ud al-Ghatafani, and he says to him, he pays him a certain amount. It's said around 20 camels, he says to him, which is a huge amount, 20 camels. And he says to him, I want you to spread information that basically the Quraysh, that they went out there, but the Muslims didn't turn up. And the Quraysh are going to come with a huge army. And so he starts spreading this information, and he's sent to the Prophet ﷺ directly. And this is Nu'aym ibn Mas'ud's first interaction with the Prophet ﷺ as a Ghatafani, and he meets the Prophet ﷺ, and he says to him that basically the Quraysh are coming to the Battle of Badr with a huge army, and he won't be able to basically withstand them. So the intention behind this whole ploy was to scare the Muslims so they wouldn't turn up, and so that the Quraysh could save face. But did it work? The Prophet ﷺ said, I'll go out there even by myself if I'm going to go out there and face them myself if I have to. And this is really important, this confrontation with Nu'aym ibn Mas'ud and the Prophet ﷺ, because this will make us understand what happens with Nu'aym at the Battle of the Trench later. Now, so we see that the Quraysh are desperate. They need to save face. These are the Quraysh, the head of, the authority of Arabia. Before this, they were known as Ahlullah, the people of Allah. Now they're getting utterly humiliated, and the Muslims are now becoming quite a presence in Arabia. And so, but they don't have a ploy. They don't know how they're going to get over the Muslims now. Now they've given up from confronting them. But something else has obviously occurred that's going to encourage the Quraysh to come forward and face the Muslims for another time. What's that? It's the expulsion of the Jews from Medina. So we have Banu Qaynuqa', the first ones that were expelled early on, and then we have now Bani Nadir, the tribe of Nadir, who were expelled after trying to assassinate the Prophet ﷺ, and obviously what's going to come is the expulsion eventually of Bani Qurayza. Now Bani Nadir are incredibly upset. Why? Because when they were expelled, the Prophet ﷺ allowed them to leave Medina with as much as their camels could carry, which was a large amount. This is related that they even took the doors of their own houses. This is how adamant they were trying to take as much as they possibly can. But what you need to understand is that Bani Nadir, their land was incredibly rich, and it was worth a lot of money. And so they were, now that the Bani Nadir, they had moved to Khaybar with the other Jews further outside of Medina, further on, and now they were planning and plotting how they would get their lands back. And this is Huyay ibn Akhtab. He is scheming with the Jews of Khaybar, how are we going to get back our lands and fight the Muslims? And so Huyay, what does he do? He goes to Mecca, he meets with Abu Sufyan, and he says, we're going to support you, and we get all the tribes of Arabia to finally eradicate the Muslims from Medina. And so Abu Sufyan, he's perplexed. You've got to understand, the relationship with the Jews and the Arabs was a very precarious one. The Arabs felt intimidated by the Jews, because the Jews were a people of culture, they were a people of tradition, they were people who were learned, and this made the Arabs feel a bit insecure in themselves when they were confronted by the Jews. The other thing, they were thinking, well, hang on a minute, we're idolaters, and isn't Muhammad ﷺ and yourselves closer? in your practices and your beliefs. Why on earth are you coming to us, against them? It doesn't seem to make sense. And so Abu Sufyan and the Quraysh, they ask a very important question. They ask the question, who's more on the truth then? He teaches the teaching of one God and calls people to thus, and practicing the law to worship the one God. If you're supporting us, implicitly you're saying that basically we're actually more on the truth than they are. You're not fighting for the truth. And so what does the Jews reply? They say, you are more guided than them. So they basically completely forego them. They go back on their principles completely, and they out of their greed to regain back their lands, they're willing to give up all their principles. And this is where they fail. That when we give up on our principles and our faith is everything. If you give up on your principles and your faith, you lose the respect of the people and you lose the dunya eventually as well. And this is a huge lesson here. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this in Surah Nisa, أَلَمْ تَرَ إِلَى الَّذِينَ يَزْعَمُونَ أَنَّهُمْ أَلَمْ تَرَ إِلَى الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا نَصِيبًا مِنَ الْكِتَابِ يَزْعَمُونَ أَنَّهُمْ أُوتُوا نَصِيبًا مِنَ الْكِتَابِ وَيُؤْمِنُونَ بالجبت والطاغوت ويقولون للذين كفروا هؤلاء أهدى من الذين آمنوا سبيلا. So it says, do you not see, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addressing the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, do you not see those who claim that they've been given a portion, a share of the book? So they've got a share of it still, but they haven't got the full thing now. It's been perverted. نصيب من الكتاب ويؤمنون بالجبت والطاغوت, and they believe in jibt and taghut. How do we translate jibt? I don't know. Like this tyranny and this taghut and this tyranny oppression, which means referring to shaitan. They believe in shaitan. They follow his way. وَيَقُولُونَ, and they say to the ones who disbelieve, these are more guided than those who believe in their path. And so Allah exposed them straight away for saying these things. And so another lesson from this is that when people go back on their principles, they will be exposed. They're always scared that they're going to be exposed. And now with social media and so forth, you're definitely going to get exposed one way or another, because everything's out there. And so it's so important that we keep to our principles and stand by what we believe. And so they go to the Quraysh eventually agree. Then what does Huyay ibn Akhtab do next? He heads to Ghatafan. And so whilst he heads to Ghatafan, the Quraysh, they're gathering up all their allies as well. So what the Quraysh, they muster around 4,000 of their own. And then with the Jews, along with the Jews of Khaybar and the Jews of Bani Nadir, and then these other northern tribes, they managed to muster up a force of around 10,000 against the Muslims, which are around probably, if anything, 2,500. We have narrations that there was about 1,000 of them actually participating in the digging of the trench, in terms of men, women and children and so forth, probably around 2,500 against a force of 10,000. And this was unprecedented in Arab history. Never before had there been this showdown between the powers of Islam, this new force that appeared in Arabia, and the powers of the ancient idolatry. Usually, historically, you might get two gangs basically supporting one another against another or two, but this is the whole city basically. Not the city, this is the whole area of Arabia now coming together in force against either truthhood or falsehood. This was unprecedented. So we now know historically this is going to set the standard now. We know something is going to happen. Now what's interesting is that Ghatafan themselves have no real interest in this. Because Ghatafan, they're further north. And they're not affected. So if you think about it, they're north of Medina. They're not going to be affected by their trade routes, if anything, are not affected. Ghatafan were hardcore, mercenaries. They had no principles. They were rough characters, and you see the qualities of the mercenary nature is that when the Jews go up to them, and the Jews say, "If you support us," they say to the tribes of Ghatafan, "if you support us, we will give you a half of our produce of Khaybar." Oh, sorry, Bani Nadir would have been there. The half of their produce, if we get it back, for the year, and that's a huge amount of their dates. Now, what do the Ghatafan do? They go to the Prophet ﷺ and say, they're offering us half, what are you going to give? They're cutthroat, these people. They say, we stay at home if you can better their deal. So you can see here that Ghatafan, they're not interested whatsoever. They just want to see what they can get out of this. And we get to see Ghatafan, the head of Ghatafan, was a man called Uyayna ibn Hisn. And Uyayna ibn Hisn was a right character. He was the one where the Prophet, he basically, when he went to see the Prophet ﷺ, he walked straight into his house with Sayyidah Aisha. This is before the revelation of the hijab. And he basically said, Ya Muhammad, and he walks in with all his audacity. And the Prophet ﷺ said, you know, do you not know manners? You know, when you ask for permission before you come in, he says, we Bani Nizar, we've never asked permission from a Mudari to ever come into his house. And so there's this competition between the two tribes. So see how he responds to the Prophet ﷺ. And he says, who's this one with you? Referring to Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha. Who's this fair lady, this red complexion? And he says, this is Aisha, my wife. He says, if you want, I'll give you one of my wives, so who's better than her? Now this was the sort of character that Uyayna ibn Hisn was. When he walked out, the Prophet ﷺ said, this is the ahmaqul muta'. He says, this guy's an idiot that people stand by. He says, why were you so nice to him? This is an important lesson that the Prophet ﷺ established here. He says, then why were you so nice to him? He says, you have to be careful. Those people who are like this character, you have to be nice in front of them to protect yourself from their evil. Because if you upset these people, they just unleash havoc. And so this is a huge lesson for us. Sometimes, you know, if you think about it, you know, the politicians do it all the time. We just had, obviously, our fair lady go and see Mr. Trump himself. You have to be polite. You've got to achieve goals and so forth. And so the Prophet ﷺ is teaching us, when it comes to politics, sometimes you have to, you know, feign things. Not that you're lying to them, but you're having to show a face that's not necessarily the truth, because you need to protect yourself. And you've got to look, what's the lesser of the two? Evil. Diplomacy, exactly. And so, alhamdulillah, I've got an active audience. And your name is? Sulaiman, inshallah. So, this is the situation now. And some of the, so that's Uyayna ibn Hisn. From the Bani Fazara, we have another character. Uyayna ibn Hisn is from Bani Fazara, and then we've got Bani Asad. They have what's his gender? The Tulayha. Was it Tulayha? The King's prophet. Tulayha. Who? So you see the characters now that are coming together with the Jews and with the Quraysh in order to attack the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Tulayha, once the Prophet ﷺ passes away in the time of Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he claims prophecy. And he's a really interesting personality, because eventually he runs when Khalid ibn Walid defeats his tribe. He runs to Syria, and he actually repents and becomes an actual pious Muslim. And he dies, I think it was the Battle of Qadisiyah, he actually dies defending the Muslims and standing there, and he performs some incredible feats in the Battle of Qadisiyah. So that's a huge lesson for us, because it says even the worst of the worst, you know, you never know what's going to happen eventually. And this person eventually repents, and you can't get worse than claiming prophecy against, you know, after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so we never know what someone's end is. And so, but anyway, you've got an idea now of the sort of characters that are coming together against the Muslims. So that's what's happening before the actual battle. The actual information obviously reaches the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as is his practice, he gathers the Muslims together and he seeks counsel. And this is a huge wisdom, in that real leaders, they seek wisdom and counsel from their people. Why? One of the wisdoms is that it instills that basically when you enable someone to share in something, you're more likely to get them to give their heart to the thing. Instead of going there and actually telling someone, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, what do you have to share? And what's really beautiful here is, the Prophet ﷺ says, how are we going to deal with this? We've got 10,000, unprecedented, we've never had such a force against us. How are we going to deal with this situation? And who stands up to give the Prophet ﷺ some advice? Who was it? Sulaiman, I'm going to pick on you. Anyone? Salman al-Farisi. Yes, Salman al-Farisi, obviously, he's going to suggest, what's he going to suggest, Salih? Exactly. And this is really important, yes.
Wasn't it Suhaib al-Rumi who suggested a trench?
No, it was Salman al-Farisi.
Oh, right.
Yeah, to the best of, there might be different, always there's different riwayas, but the riwayah...
I just thought because he's Roman, so...
Oh no, because this is really interesting, because first of all, we've got to look at Salman himself. Obviously the story of Salman is very famous, but he's a non-Arab, okay? He's just been free, like he never participated in the Battle of Badr. He never participated in the Battle of Uhud. Why not?
Because he wasn't Quraysh?
No, not because of that. Excellent. Who's that? What's your name? Muhammad. Well done. He was still a slave. He was a slave of a... Do you know who his master was? You don't know? Yes, exactly. He was a Jewish man. He still hadn't claimed his freedom yet. In the time of Badr and the time of Uhud. Now he's free. Okay, he's been freed, which is a famous story. That obviously the Jewish man asked for such and such an amount, isn't it? How many date palms and the gold and so forth, and they eventually managed to release Salman. So you've got to imagine this man's not participated with the Muslims. He's not an Arab. He's not a Qurayshi. He's not like Sa'd ibn Ubadah or Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, these dignitaries of Aus and Khazraj, and they're listening to him. This is very profound. There was a real fraternity amongst the Muslims. Whoever's got something to give. We need to share, and that's even in the durus. You know, we should never feel like, you know, the Sheikh's giving it, and we should listen to him. And I've heard something. I'm sure that's wrong. I can't speak out though. No, it's just about sharing. You know, my teachers in the Qaraween, they always said, "I'm a talib al-ilm. I've just been studying a bit longer than you. That's all. We're all seekers of knowledge. I've got a bit more knowledge than you, but it doesn't mean we can't share with one another. It's research. We're all researching together, benefiting one another." And so this was an attitude of the Muslims. And so Salman, he says, the Persians were attacked, they used to build a trench around the city to protect them. The Arabs, this was, again, unprecedented. The Arabs had never done anything like this. And so the Prophet ﷺ agrees to his suggestion. And what we learn from this is that in terms of issues like this, there's no issue whatsoever of us benefiting from different cultures. There's always something we can benefit. As long as it doesn't conflict with our religion, there's always something we can learn from one another. But it has its time and place. Because what's really interesting is way after the Prophet ﷺ passes away, in the time of Muhammad Zaki al-Nafs, who was called Muhammad the Purified Soul, he was attacked by the Abbasids, and they surrounded Medina. And he had the sword, if my memory serves me well, he had the sword of Sayyidina Ali. And what did they do when the army of the Abbasids came to attack them? He built a trench. But times have moved on, and the Abbasid army, they just put planks down basically and walked straight in. And Muhammad Zaki al-Nafs, he was martyred. And his brothers, they basically fled, one of the brothers that were present there, one of them being Idris ibn Abdin there, who actually flees to Morocco and establishes the first Sharif or Sayyid dynasty. To the best of my knowledge, the only Sayyid dynasty that was established, that was successful in the Muslim lands. But what we learn from this is there's always time and place. Because what worked then does not necessarily mean it's going to work now. And the Muslims, often more than not, we fall into moments of nostalgia, as if, you know, if we employ everything that happened in the Prophet ﷺ's life, everything will work out. No, we have to look at our context, we have to look at our situation. And so that's very important. It worked then, it didn't necessarily work later. And so the Muslims, they employ this. Now they've got a dilemma. Obviously, did they build a trench around the whole of the city? As many people think. Was that the case? No. Why not? Because obviously we have these two mountains on either side of Medina, and then on the other side we have all these huge thick pasture of date palms basically that belong to Beni Qurayza. And so the only clear area was now, which we say, I think they call them Masajid al-Fath, don't they? Is that what they call them? Yeah, so you've got those mosques where we now go and visit. So you've got Uhud this side, and it's just, so if you're got Uhud on your right, it's just to your left, this area. This was the only open area. And obviously the army, they haven't got the freedom to just keep walking around wherever they wish to go. And so they have to choose a position. And so they chose that position because of that. And they knew they would choose that position. So what did the Muslims do? They built this trench which stretched, according to the most reliable opinions, stretched about 1.25 miles. Okay, it was 2 kilometers or 2.5 kilometers. And the Prophet ﷺ, he allotted like sections for the Muslims. Let's say, for example, 20 meters, and then he would allot, and so there'd be a portion for a certain group from amongst the emigrants, the Muhajirin, and there would be a certain section for members from the Ansar, like the Aus and the Kharaj and so. And this is where they were fighting over Salman al-Farisi, who he would dig with. And so they would say that Salman is from us, the Ansar, and then they say Salman is from us, the Muhajirin, and the Prophet ﷺ said he is from me, Ahlul Bayt, and he would dig with my family. And so the Prophet ﷺ and his own family, amongst the men, were digging in order to establish this trench. And so this is the situation now. They're digging through, and obviously all they've got is pickaxes, basically, and they're digging this trench with about 1,000 men, and an area that's just over 1 mile long. And so you can imagine that's a huge task, and they've got to accomplish it in a very short space of time. It's narrated that they did it in about 7 days. Around 7 days, they completed this digging of the trench, because obviously the army's coming in at any time. And so the Muslims are really striving to achieve this as quickly as possible. And many miracles happen around this. And so, for example, the Prophet ﷺ, and there's 2 narrations about this, he sees Ammar ibn Yasir, who was really he had drive in order to complete this. He's still a young man, and he was completely covered in dust and carrying rocks on his back, moving all the debris of the digging the trench. And the Prophet ﷺ made dua for him, and he said, "Sataqtulukum al-fi'at al-baghiyah." He says, and this is mentioned, there's 2 narrations. There's one that this is when he was actually helping build the masjid, the mosque of the Prophet ﷺ, and there's another narration that it was here at the battle of the digging of the trench. The Prophet ﷺ prophesied, he says that Yasir, you will be killed by the wrongful party, basically. What's he referring to? This is one of the miracles of the Prophet ﷺ. He's referring that Yasir, whose side will he be on when 2 parties are fighting in the future? Who are they? Yes, exactly. Which side will he be fighting on? Yasir, Ammar ibn Yasir.
Fighting on the side of Ahlul Bayt?
Of Sayyidina Ali, when he's against Muawiyah. So they took this as a sign, because he was killed. He was killed, Ammar ibn Yasir, at the battle of the Jamal, the battle of Siffin. And this was, they took note, everyone was aware of this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that he would be killed by the Fi'l Baghiyah. Not to say that Sayyidina Muawiyah radiallahu anhu was obviously outside of Islam, but he was the one that went against the leadership. And this is what we understand from this Fi'l Baghiyah. He went against the leadership, and they were wrong, but they were rewarded for their decision. But in the end, they were wrong. They were wrong to stand up against Sayyidina Ali. And so they took from the Prophet ﷺ's hadith here, because Ammar ibn Yasir was fighting on the side of Sayyidina Ali, that he was on the correct side. Other miracles that we see, obviously, we know the famous hadith where they're struggling to move the rock. There's 2 narrations actually, which is interesting. Well, these 2 different situations. The famous one is the one where the Prophet ﷺ, they can't even dent this rock, this kudya, basically this huge, massive boulder. They couldn't even make a dent in it. So they go to the Prophet ﷺ. So that they initially say, well, the Prophet ﷺ demarcated an area that we should dig. So this, before they actually built the trench, the Prophet ﷺ, he demarcated, he made a line saying this is where we're going to dig. And when they hit the boulder, when they came across this boulder, they say, we can't move this, we should maybe dig around it. And so some of the other Sahaba says, no, we have to go to the Prophet ﷺ. He demarcated where we should dig, and so we do not go against his command. We either, first of all, we ask we consult him on it, and then we make the decision. So you see the adherence of the Sahaba to the command of the Prophet ﷺ. They go to the Prophet ﷺ, explain the situation. This is a huge wisdom for us. But when we're in situations, we've got an order in our religion to do a certain thing, that we turn to scholars. We go to the scholars and we ask them, this is our situation, are we allowed to divert from this position because it's, might be these circumstances, and we consult. We don't just say, well, this is a situation, we just take it out. It's always important we consult people of expertise in any field of whatever we're doing. I'm going to embark on this thing. What's the best thing to do? Speak to people who have expertise and experience in these fields. And so they consult the Prophet ﷺ because he commanded it, and he said, show me it. And so in one narration, he actually takes some water and he spits in it, in the water, and then he takes it to it, and then and he makes dua over it, and then they pour it over the rock, and the rock literally disappears, literally crumbles. That's one narration. Is this a different situation? Allah knows best. The most famous narration, obviously, is that he takes a pickaxe himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he strikes it, and with one strike he says, I see a bolt of lightning basically flash up, and he says, Allahu Akbar. He says, I see the palaces of Sham. Another narration, which one was first? We got Sham first, or of Persia, of Ctesiphon, the capital of Persia. He says, I see them, they've been opened up. I see the red palaces of Sham, of the Levant, which is Jerusalem and Syria and Lebanon, this area now. Then the second strike, Allahu Akbar, a huge crack in the rock, and he says, I see the palace, the white arches of Ctesiphon, which we still see today, Madain, which is in Iraq. This huge structure that's still standing. And he says the third strike, two narrations, he says all that was between the east and the west lit up, and another one in Sana'a. It says Yemen will be taken by the Muslims. And you've got to look at the circumstances. You've got a 10,000 man army coming at you, and you're struggling to move this rock, and you're building this trench that's only going to hold them out. What's the tactics? The Muslims don't have great, the tactic is basically to hold them out as long as we possibly can. And so it's very bleak for the Muslims, the situation. And then we've got the Prophet ﷺ saying that, we're going to conquer Syria, we're going to conquer Persia, we're going to conquer Yemen, or from the east to the west. You're thinking, my goodness, and this is exactly the Munafiqun says here. We don't. This is how they responded. They said, we can't even go to the bathroom. We haven't got time to go to the bathroom. And Muhammad, this is how they said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's telling us we're going to conquer. It just seemed crazy to them. And that's what. But the believers, they were like, Allahu Akbar. They had this yaqeen with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that they would succeed. So there's a huge lesson here. And now they've built this trench now around. The Prophet ﷺ does something very interesting here, the foresight of the Prophet ﷺ. He takes the women, the weak, and the children to one of the fortresses of Banu Haritha. And Banu Haritha, they were Muslims from the Ansar, and they had some fortresses, which are very unique because the Arabs generally didn't live in fortresses. Who lived in fortresses? The Jews, exactly. The Jews, they weren't like great fighters. They weren't renowned for their fighting, but they were renowned because they relied on their fortresses. They had these huge fortresses that were impenetrable. People weren't able to get into them. And Banu Haritha, because obviously the Ansar had close relations with the Jews, they adopted certain practices from the Jews. And one of them was they had a fortress which they called Al-Fari', this fortress. And the Prophet ﷺ said, so here we are, that we've got the Muslims, and they're going to be facing the army coming on, but from below, they've got the tribe of Bani Qurayza. And the Prophet ﷺ, his foresight, he knows that there's a risk. Are the Bani Qurayza going to stay with us or not? And this is a huge foresight of the Prophet ﷺ. He was taking into consideration any possibility, anything that could happen. And so he sends the women and the weak and the children to stay in this fortress to keep them safe, so that they won't be, because there's this risk that the Jews of Medina could attack them. And so you've got a fifth column within your own forces, and so you're being attacked from the outside and you're being attacked from the inside. The Prophet ﷺ recognised this, and this is why the Prophet ﷺ, which is very important, is that the Prophet ﷺ, when he expelled Qaynuqa', the tribe of Qaynuqa', he went up to Bani Nadir and Bani Qurayza and says, are you still on the terms and conditions that we made with one another when we entered Medina? He wanted to stress this. And this is to show that the Prophet ﷺ had no issues with the Jews. It was the issue was what they did, not because who they were. This is very, very important that we understand this. The Prophet ﷺ expelled the Jews because of what they did, not because of who they were. And the Prophet ﷺ made alliances with them and treaties with them. And every time he expelled one of the tribes, he understood psychologically what impact that would have on the other Jewish tribes that still remained in Medina. And so he'd go to them and say, are you still on the tribe? He says, it's up to you. So are you still on the treaties? And they affirmed that they were. And then Bani Nadir were expelled. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he said to Bani Qurayza again, are you on the treaties? And they said, we were. And so we've got to understand, when the Bani Qurayza, when the Bani Qurayza did what they did, it was one of the most heinous crimes ever. And what's really interesting is, what's really important to stress is, who did they go for and attack the Bani Qurayza when they basically went against their treaty with the Muslims? Who did they attack first? They went to the fortress of Thaqib to kill the women and the children. So we understand the mentality of Bani Qurayza, and it's understandable that they got what they got, basically. And that's another topic that's initially we're going to address that, but it's a huge topic in itself that needs to be addressed, the Bani Qurayza. And so now, once the army arrived, obviously, of the Quraysh and their alliances, the Ahzab, the Confederates, now they're thinking, what on earth have we got in front of us? This trench, we've never seen anything like it. And the Quraysh had no idea how they were going to counteract this trench. The Prophet ﷺ had one strategy, that he would basically have 24 hours people walking up and down the trench crying out Allahu Akbar, so that the Quraysh and their allies would feel that the forces of the Muslims was actually larger than it actually was. And the Prophet ﷺ, this is what's else, is the Prophet ﷺ wasn't a leader that sat back. He was a leader that participated in the building of the trench, and he actually went out and he scouted himself. And we have a narration that the Prophet ﷺ once was doing this at night, and then Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhu, he came up, and the Prophet ﷺ said, who's there? It was a very dark night, and he could hear the chainmail of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. He says, it's me, Ya Rasulullah. He says, I knew that you were on your turn of scouting the area and crying out Allahu Akbar. I wish to get as you were. See, the Muslims were struggling themselves, but they couldn't bear to see the Prophet ﷺ struggling. And so they said the Prophet ﷺ went back to his tent where Sayyidah Aisha was. She decided to stay behind with the Prophet ﷺ. She didn't go to the fortress of Khandaq. And she stayed with the Prophet ﷺ. She said when he came back to the tent, he completely collapsed because he was so tired. This was the sort of sacrifice. When Jabir ibn Abdullah, he goes and sees the Prophet ﷺ digging with him in the trenches. He says he lifted up his arm, and his shirt lifted up, and I saw that he had 2 stones pressed against his chest and holding them there to help the pangs of hunger. Now, they say, why did they put these 2 stones there? I've read different things about these stones, and maybe Sheikh Zakir or some of you can enlighten me. They say Qussus mentions in his commentary on the Shama'il that it would calm, the coolness of the stones would actually calm down the heat of the pangs of hunger. That was one of the wisdoms. Have you heard anything else why they did it?
The stomach become bloated. These stones, the coolness of the stone reduce the size of the stomach. They would feel hunger. They would not feel hunger less.
Okay, yeah, so obviously when someone becomes hungry, their stomach swells, like you see pictures of people like in East Africa and so forth that suffer from famine. If you notice the little boys, they've got their stomachs are quite inflated, you're thinking, are they starving? They've got big bellies. But the reality is that when you actually, you are starving, that's what happens to your stomach. And so the rock, they held it in to actually push that back. And so Jabir ibn Abdullah, when he sees the Prophet ﷺ has actually got more rocks than the others, and he's suffering just as much. They went 3 days, they were saying, they hadn't eaten a thing. And they're not just, they haven't eaten, they're having to do strenuous work as well. You know, and when we see the strength of the Prophet ﷺ, is that he's able to destroy this rock, this boulder, despite that the hunger didn't even weaken the Prophet ﷺ. Some scholars actually use this as a proof to say that the hunger never weakened the Prophet ﷺ. He ate actually out of choice. He never ate because he needed to, because of the hadith that my Lord, He suffices me and nourishes me. Wallahu a'lam. And so, Jabir ibn Abdullah, another example of the Sahaba, are so touched to see the Prophet ﷺ struggling like they're struggling, if not more so. And so he asks the Prophet ﷺ permission. Because at this point, the Muslims have to have permission from the Prophet ﷺ to leave the area. And so the Prophet ﷺ gives him permission, and he rushes back to his wife, and he says, right, what have we got of food? And she says, all we've got is some flour, a small amount of flour, and a young goat that's not even ready. You don't sacrifice a baby, a young goat. You let it grow, and you want it to get strong, so there's more meat in those days. And so this is all we've got. And so Jabir, he says, he goes and slaughters the sheep. He says, you prepare the bread. He then rushes off to the Prophet ﷺ, and he sees the Prophet ﷺ crouching. He crouches down, he whispers in his ear. He says, "O Messenger of Allah, I've got a small amount of food that I've prepared for you. You go and, you ask a few of your close friends, people close, invite them as well, and come along and eat with me." And the Prophet ﷺ, he says, "How much food have you got?" He explains how much food he's got. And he stands up, and he says, "Yalla lads, basically, we're all going to eat at Jabir's house." And you can imagine the shock on his face. You've got 1,000 Muslims, basically. There are different narrations. Some say it's 300, some say it's 800. But we know that there was 1,000 people, actually, working the trench. And so he calls him back. He runs back to his wife. Oh, sorry. And he says, the Prophet ﷺ tells Jabir, he says, "Tell your wife, do not lift the lid off the bread, and don't lift the lid off the handy, basically, off the food." He says, "Tell them not until I come." He runs back and says, he says to his wife, "You're going to get exposed tonight." He says, "Oh my goodness me." She says, "What's with you?" He says, "I went to the Prophet ﷺ and said I was going to cook him some food. And now the whole troop's coming." And she said, "Did you do this? Or was the Prophet ﷺ say, do this?" She's like, because if you did it, your wife, she gives you trouble. But if it's someone else, who's not obviously you, then usually she gives you the benefit of the doubt. And she said, the Prophet ﷺ, and then she said, with the iman of this woman, she says, "Don't you worry. If the Prophet ﷺ said it, we've got nothing to fear." And so she calms Jabir down. Jabir is having like a panic attack, basically. My goodness me, what are we going to do? And his wife, she strengthens him and says, the Prophet ﷺ, if he said it, we have nothing to fear. Bismillah, we rely on Allah. And so the Prophet ﷺ comes, and this was so beautiful. The Prophet ﷺ, he comes in, he tells Jabir's wife, stand aside, and he feeds every one of them, the Prophet ﷺ, with his own hand. He takes out the meat, and he puts it in the bread and serves it. He tells the people to come into single file, and each person, do not push, you're going to be served. And each person served, and in the narrations, all the narrations, none of them mention that the Prophet ﷺ actually ate. We don't know, did he eat or didn't he? But what we do know is he served with his hand for the whole army of these people coming. And so, look at that, Jabir was having compassion for the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ was just thinking about his ummah, about his people. And so there he is, and then he says to Jabir's wife, "Have you eaten?" She says, "I haven't eaten yet." And he says, "Well, make sure you eat, and make sure the neighbours, the people eat as well around you, the women folk and so forth." And so this was one of the other miracles, the Prophet ﷺ feeding nearly 1,000 people from a small portion of food. This is one of the other miracles. Now, when the actual army, as we said, the army approach the trench, they make a number of attempts to actually jump over the trench. And one of the first to do that is a man called Amr ibn Abdul Wud. Now Amr ibn Abdul Wud is a fierce man, and on that battle he actually wore a red turban. And the Arabs, when they wore a red turban, that was basically, "Don't mess with me, I'm ready to kill." That's basically what the red turban symbolised. He managed to jump over on his horse the trench, and he says, "Who will spar with me?" We've seen this in the Battle of Badr and the Battle of that people come out to actually spar with one another. Amr ibn Abdul Wud says, "Who will spar with me?" And everyone says, "Whoa, this is Amr ibn Abdul Wud." No one wants to mess with him. And the Prophet ﷺ calls out, "Who will fight him?" And who stands up? Ali ibn Abi Talib. He says, "I will." And the Prophet ﷺ says, "This is Amr ibn Abdul Wud." He shouts out again, "Who will fight Amr ibn Abdul Wud?" No one says anything. Who stands up again? And we've got to realise Ali is probably about 22, 23 at this time. And Amr ibn Abd Wud, he's an elder from the Quraysh, and he probably saw Ali when he was a youngster, a baby. Third time, who will fight him? He says, this is Ibn. Again, Ali stands up, radiallahu anhu, and he says, this is Amr ibn Wud. He says, even if it is. That's what Ali's reply to him is. And so what if it's Amr ibn Abd Wud? Bring him on. And so the Prophet ﷺ gives him permission. Ali comes on his horse, and Amr ibn Wud is on his horse. And there's different narrations here. Some say when Amr ibn Abd Wud sees Ali ibn Abi Talib, he says, this is why, I've asked to fight one of the elders. Go on, Ali, go back. I've got no qualms with you. I don't want to fight you on this day. He says, I don't want to kill you. He says, but I want to kill you. And Amr becomes enraged, and he jumps off his horse, and in one narration he actually stabs his horse, in one narration. And he's ready to say, basically, I'm ready to fight to the death. And the Muslims, they're looking on, and in another narration, they stay on horseback and they start kicking the dust, basically, with their horses, and so no one can see what's actually happening between them as they're sparring. And all they hear is Ali cry out, Allahu Akbar. And they know that Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu has killed Amr ibn Abd Wud. Now they say, how did that happen? They say that Amr, he went for a strike, and he went with his full force. And Sayyidina Ali, he put up his shield, his metal shield, and Amr ibn Wud splits it in half. But at the same time, but Sayyidina Ali is able to deflect but he loses his shield. But at the same time, with instinct, Sayyidina Ali manages to make a blow, and he stabs Amr ibn Abd Wud in the neck. So you can imagine his dexterity here. Is basically instinctively he goes and he takes Amr ibn Abd Wud. Now, what's really interesting about this narration is that we hear. The very famous narration is that Sayyidina Ali came up, didn't he? And he said, call him to Islam. Have you heard this narration? It's told, he called this to Islam, and he says, no, I don't want to accept Islam. And then basically they're sparring, and then basically Amr ibn Wud takes Sayyidina Ali to the floor. Sayyidina Ali takes Amr ibn Wud to the floor, and then Amr ibn Wud spits in his face, and then he refuses to fight him. Have you heard this narration? No? This is very famous. And then he basically walks away. Sayyidina Ali takes off his sword. He says, why are you not fighting me? And then basically Amr ibn Wud, actually, he says, he stands up and tries to attack him again, and then he kills him. He says, the first time it was for myself that I was trying to kill you, when you spat me in the face. The second time I was doing it for the sake of Islam. It's not found in any narrations. And what's really interesting is that I found it's an old samurai story. The Japanese have this tradition about exactly the same thing. It's mentioned in the Masnawi actually, which is really interesting, but it has no authenticity whatsoever. So this is actually what happened between Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu and Amr ibn Abd Wud. Another few skirmishes happen. Is that Khalid ibn Walid and Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl, they managed to get over, and they spar with the Muslims. They have a bit of a tussle with one another, and they jump over. Another man, I think his name was Nufayl ibn Abdullah, he faces Zubayr, and Zubayr basically fights him. He takes his sword and he literally cuts him in two. That's the force that Zubayr ibn Awam is, a very strong individual. He cuts him in two, and everyone's just wowed. They're like, my God, that's an amazing sword you've got there. Zubayr says, it's not the sword. So he's showing off a bit. It's in that time it's permissible. In that moment you're in battle. He says, don't be telling me it's the sword. It's this. And so Zubayr ibn Awam was a ferocious fighter. And so now what's really interesting is that we only have around 6 Muslims that are killed, and we only have about 4 of the other side that are killed. So which is amazing if you think about it. You've got the battle, the siege goes on for about 25 days to a month, and all you have is a handful of people that are killed. If you had those sort of forces together today, it'd be an absolute massacre. And so the Quraysh, interestingly, they call for their dead to be brought back, and they offer money for their dead. And the Prophet ﷺ says, we do not accept money for the dead. He said, come over and get your dead and take them and bury them. And so this shows the honour of the Muslims, that they always make sure they honour the dead and honour others no matter what the circumstances. And the Prophet ﷺ told them, they came over, they took their dead, and they took them back, and they buried them. So this is what's going back and forth. And now, people are very tired. That we have a situation where the Muslims are literally all day having to defend the trenches, whereby they're even prevented from praying Asr and Maghrib right up into Isha time. And see now Umar complains, he says, we haven't even prayed. And the Prophet ﷺ, he made dua against them. He says, these people prevented us from the Salat al-Wusta, the middle prayer. May Allah fill their graves with fire for this. So we see very strong language. The Prophet ﷺ, when does he get passionate? When it becomes religion. These people have prevented us from the prayer, from our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah fill their graves with fire for this. And so it was nothing personal. It was about the religion of Allah, the Prophet ﷺ. This is when he stood up with great veracity and strength and courage. And so because of this, what do? There's a difference of opinion. Why did they not pray the Salat al-Khawf? When was the Salat al-Khawf actually legislated? And so to the best of my knowledge, the strongest opinion that it was already being legislated, the Salat al-Khawf. And so the reason it was just so manic, basically, they just literally couldn't pray. So there's a huge wisdom in this. We see in situations, like for example, a doctor or a midwife or so forth, they're in a situation they can't just suddenly say, oh, excuse me, I've got to pray. That it's permissible in those situations to actually delay the prayer, because we have to deal with things that are more imperative. And so the Muslims understood this as well, because it was a risk of life. And so they're going back and forth, and now what happens? This is where Huyay ibn Akhtab, he sneaks in round the back, he walks in. So it's possible for a small number of people to get round the other side of Medina, but they couldn't take the whole army, and so they couldn't attack from there. But Huyay, he goes up to Bani Qurayza now, and he knocks on the door of Ka'b ibn Asad, and he says, let me in. He says, no way am I letting you in. You're trouble, you are. He says, Ka'b says to Huyay, remember Huyay's from Bani Nadir, these are the ones that tried to attempt to assassinate the Prophet ﷺ. This is the father of Safiya, who eventually becomes who? The wife of the Prophet ﷺ, the one who had the dream about the moon landing in her lap. And so Huyay, he's trouble. They saw him as a bad omen, basically. And Ka'b ibn Asad, who's the head of Bani Qurayza, he says, get away from us. I don't want anything to do with you. Every time you come, you cause issues. He says, you're like a cloud. We think rain's coming, you just bring thunder and lightning, you do. He says, in those, obviously for them, a cloud, they think it's rejoice, and then you think rain's going to come and so your crops. He says, you're like the cloud. We all think you're going to bring something blessed, and you come with thunder and lightning, you do. You always bring issues. And so he says, no, you don't understand. And he's trying to convince Ka'b ibn Asad, and Ka'b ibn Asad having none of it. He says, we're not breaking our ties, our treaties with the Prophet with Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Huyay tries a different ploy. And this is, you can understand this. He uses family politics in there. He says, the only reason you don't want to open the door to me is because you're stingy and don't want to feed me. He says, here I am starving, and you don't open your door to me. What sort of treatment is this? We're from the same tribe. And so that he gets him basically there. And so Ka'b, the family black male, he's even prone to it. And so he lets him in. And so as soon as he lets him in, Huyay starts his tactics with him. He's saying, you don't understand, we've got an army of 10,000, and you don't we can't lose here. He says, just go back on your ties. Ka'b ibn Asad, he's not having any of it. Eventually, Huyay managed to convince him, because obviously this is about, they're from the same tribe, they both want Medina, they want them back. And so eventually, Ka'b ibn Asad, he gives up, and he concedes, and he says, okay, we stand by you. And so this is when they are basically, the Jews act treacherously against the Muslims, and the Prophet ﷺ gets whiff of it. And he said, who will go and basically find out information of what's happening at Bani Qurayza? And Zubayr ibn Awam stands up and he says, I will. And this is where the Prophet ﷺ says, every prophet has a disciple, and my disciple is Zubayr ibn Awam. Because you've got to understand, like that Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam sent his disciples out into the lands in order to deliver the message. This is the illusion that he's alluding to. The Prophet ﷺ with Zubayr ibn Awam. He goes. We have no narrations of what actually happened, but probably more than likely what happened was that Zubayr actually caught Huyay ibn Akhtab going outside the doors, and so he knew something was up. So he goes back to the Prophet ﷺ. He says, subtly he tells him discreetly that basically it's not good, it doesn't bode well. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he doesn't accept just Zubayr's testimony. He says, I've got to make sure. And so he sends Sa'd ibn Mu'adh and Sa'd ibn Ubadah, the heads of the Aws and the Khazraj, to go, because they had elite alliances with the Jews of Qurayza. And so they go up, they knock on the door, and basically the Jews tell them outright that they've basically gone back on all their treaties with the Muslims. One of the Sa'ds becomes enraged and starts cursing them and says, how dare you, how can you do this? You know, it's an incredibly desperate situation. And the other Sa'd says, look, this isn't a time to curse people. You know, this is about, we've got to take advantage of the time. We need to get back to the Prophet ﷺ. What's interesting, the Prophet ﷺ said, if you find out they've been acting treacherously, do not, he says, indicate, gesture to me. Don't tell me explicitly, because he doesn't want to cause panic amongst the Muslims. When they come back, they look at the Prophet ﷺ and they say, Adl wa Qara. And these were the two tribes that betrayed the Muslims at the Bi'r Ma'una when they killed I think you've covered this, yes? But they were killed by they called them to actually teach them the religion, and they betrayed them and killed them. And so he says, basically, we're in the same situation as them. So they just said that, Adl wa Qara. And so the Prophet ﷺ knew what happened, and he said, Allahu Akbar. This is look, you're in a situation where you're being attacked from a fifth column within you, and the Prophet ﷺ just saw positivity from this. He said, Allahu Akbar. He said, Abshiru. He says, give glad tidings. He says, basically, we've been given the lands of Bani Qurayza, because this was a massive investment. This is a huge amount of money. And so the Prophet basically had expelled the Jewish tribes within Medina now, and they were to take their lands. He knew what was he foresaw what was going to come. And so he just took glad tidings from this. Which is, you know, everyone else, there would be absolute panic. Because what happens now? The Muslims in Fari', in the fortress, the Bani Qurayza send 2 scouts to go check out Fari' to see if there's any men around there. And when they're in, basically, the Safiya, the aunt of the Prophet ﷺ, she hears people stirring outside. And so she nudges, who? Hassan ibn Thabit. Hassan ibn Thabit, do you think, what on earth is he doing in the fortress with the men, with the women and the elderly? Hassan, he was not a man that knew how to fight. Who was Hassan ibn Thabit? What was he famous for? He was famous for his poetry. And as we find more often more than not, people of the arts, they usually, this is a huge generalisation, but people of the arts, they're usually, they're better with the pen than they are with the sword. I don't know what Mudassir's like with a sword, but he's a calligrapher at any rate. And so Hassan, he was not a very brave man. I mean, Abdullah ibn Zubayr, he says he was cowardice. This was his nature. He said when he used to pick up a sword, he'd shake. And so he knew his circumstances, which is beautiful. It shows that the Sahaba are all of different natures, and they all had their strength. Despite him having this weakness of character, no one could do what Hassan ibn Thabit could do. Was basically, he stood, and the Prophet ﷺ made dua for him. He says, the Holy Spirit stands by you, Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam, as long as you defend Allah and His Messenger. And so the Prophet ﷺ loved him. He had a minbar in the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ, defending the Prophet ﷺ with poetry. But this shows that we can have weaknesses. It doesn't. Not all the Sahaba, they had their strengths and they had their weaknesses, but they had, and they played to their strengths and they accepted their weaknesses when they had them. And so Hassan says, I'm not going out there. He says, oh, aunt of the Messenger of Allah, what are you trying to do to me? He says, you know my circumstances, you know what I'm like, please. So what does Safiya do? And this is the mother of Zubayr ibn Awam. We just saw what Zubayr ibn Awam did to someone when he cut the man in 2. Now we're going to see what the mother can do. And so the mother basically puts a blade in her mouth and climbs out the window and up the fortress. You know, this is like Hollywood style. And then she basically clothes herself in a dress like a man. And then, because one of the men has reached the top, she basically slits his throat and throws his head to the other one. She's a tough woman. And the man screams, and he runs off. And she climbs all the way back down, goes to Hassan and says, Hassan, I've dealt with it, don't worry, but go and get his armour out there. And he says, I've got no need of that. What are you asking me to do that for? And then she's like, what am I going to do with this man? And so we see the strength of some of the women amongst the Sahaba. But why did she ask that? Because you've got to understand, armour and weaponry was incredibly expensive. It was a huge investment to buy a chain of mail and so forth. And so this is why the booty, when people actually finished the battle, that it was a huge thing for them to collect these things. And you've got to also understand, when people went into battle in that time, there was no state fund to support the army. Basically, you were going on an army, like if we look at the Battle of Tabuk later, you've got these people going, they've got to finance it all themselves. You think, I'm going out there on a battle, and I've got to support myself, I've got to pay for my horse, I've got to feed it, I've got to buy the armour, I've got all these things I've got to take into consideration. And the only reward you're going to get is what? What reward are you going to get going on this battle?
Freedom.
Well, we might go. You're going to get two things: either martyrdom, or you're going to get the booty of war if you're lucky. But that was a huge investment for them. So this is how things were in those days, and this is why the booty of war was a huge, reward for them. Now, so this is the situation now. So the Prophet ﷺ, he sends some men to basically defend the fortress. Obviously, they don't really need any support when they've got Sophia, the aunt of the Prophet ﷺ. But they send an army now to protect them because they realise what the situation is. Now, what's the next situation that happens now? We have the first of all that Sa'd ibn Mu'adh gets injured and he gets a mortal blow. Basically, the Prophet ﷺ, he had armour on, Sa'd, and before he went out to battle, he went to visit his mother. And Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha, she reports, if only he had a bit more money to buy more armour, because his arms are exposed. And this is exactly where he gets hit, Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, a man from amongst the I can't remember which tribe it was, Ibn Ariqa, I think his name was, and he shot an arrow and struck him in the arm, and it was a mortal wound basically. He was bleeding from it incessantly after that. They couldn't stop the bleeding. And the Sa'd made a dua against the man. He says, "Arraq Allahu wajhaka fin nar." He says, "May Allah make you sweat in the hellfire for what you've done." He played on his name. His name was Ariqa, and which means sweat. So Ariqa means sweat. It's played on that root. Now, Sa'd he says, now he's heard of the betrayal of Quraysh. He says, may I not, he says, if the Muslims are never to face the Quraysh again, then let me die, but let me not die until I see the Bani Qurayza get their just deserts. And this is exactly what happens, because as you'll see later, is that the Prophet ﷺ, he appointed Sa'd ibn Mu'adh to actually judge over the Jews. And remember, he had huge alliances with them, and they chose him and selected him to enact the judgment on them. And so that's for a later date. Now the main thing comes. Who did we mention at the beginning of the talk? A man called Nu'aym ibn Mas'ud. Do you remember I said that Abu Sufyan sent him in order to spread lies that the Quraysh were coming with a huge army for the second confrontation at Badr. Now Nu'aym, he says, Allah, this is amazing. He says, Allah on that night, he struck me with Iman. And I became a Muslim. Like that, suddenly was struck. But we know that he had interaction with the Prophet ﷺ beforehand, so he must have been impressed by the courage of the Prophet ﷺ when he said, whether I don't care what number of men I have to face at Badr, even if I have to face alone. He saw these qualities and the virtues of the Prophet ﷺ, and he must have been impressed by him. But that night, Islam entered his heart, and so he sneaked into the Muslims' camp, and he said to the Prophet ﷺ, how can I serve you, O Messenger of Allah? He accepts Islam, he says, how can I serve you? And the Prophet ﷺ, he says, what are you going to do? He says, I don't know what the situation. He says, do what you can. He says, can I use khid'ah, basically? Can I play around and do things in order to bring about a result? And the Prophet ﷺ said, al-harbu khid'ah. This is the famous quote that war is not treachery, war is deception. And so khiyana is haram, but in war, khid'ah is playing around with things, basically feigning something and people assuming something, and it's not the case. This is permissible, and this is what everyone does in war. If you think about any war situation, there's always things being spread in order to basically lower the morale of the enemy, because you're trying to save people's lives. And so he says, use whatever means you can, but khiyana, not going against treaties. We see Bani Qurayza, they commit khiyana, treachery. But the Prophet ﷺ is saying, no, khid'ah, which is an element of deception in order to bring about a result. And so the Prophet ﷺ says, do what you can. Now, we have to look at how Allah basically orchestrated this whole thing. Look, before this Nu'aym ibn Mas'ud, he had no affiliations with the Muslims, but he had business ties with Abu Sufyan. Abu Sufyan trusted him because he had basically carried out that task that he asked him to do. He also had trade with Bani Qurayza. He says, before Islam, I was basically a drinking partner with the Bani Qurayza. I used to socialise with them and do business with them and so forth. And so they trusted me. Look how Allah's working. And then also, he's not the head of Ghatafan, the tribe of Ghatafan, but he's respected amongst his people. So he can bring about a result. He goes to Qurayza and he says, the Quraysh, they're going to give up on you. It's been 25 days, if not now. It's been so many days, nothing's happened. They're going to be treacherous against you. They're just going to leave. He says, so if they do come to you, say to them, I want 70 of your noble men to guarantee that you will stand by us. We need some sort of vouch from you to vouch that you're going to still defend us. We want 70 of your men. They will fight with us. And then what does he do? He says he goes over to the Quraysh and he says, the Bani Qurayza, they're gonna, if you go and speak to them, they're going to ask for 70 of your noble men. If they do this, know that they're going to be treacherous. They regret what they've done towards the Prophet ﷺ, and they want to make it up to him. So they want 70 of your noble men, and they're going to slaughter them. And so Abu Sufyan says, what sort of treachery is this? What's going on? And then, so he goes and sees them. Who does he send? He goes. The Bani Qurayza come to the Quraysh and they say, we need to, we need to solve the situation here. But before we take any act, we need 70 of your men. Abu Sufyan, he says, I need to make a decision later. He says, I can't make a decision now. I need to consult my people. He goes, this is exactly what Nu'aym ibn Mas'ud mentioned, that they're going to betray us. What sort of treachery is this? I can't believe they've done this. And then, what's really interesting is, but Abu Sufyan, he's had enough of this whole situation. And he says, we're going to attack tomorrow, regardless of what it is. And what day is it? It's Friday. And when it hits sunset, the Jews, what day is it for them? The Sabbath. So, will they fight on the Sabbath? Of course not. But the Quraysh have no idea about Jewish custom. They're not exposed to the Jews like this. They don't have a deep understanding of their faith. He sends Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl and a group from amongst the Quraysh to go to them. He says, we've had enough, we're going to strike the Muslims tomorrow, get done with this and finish it. And then they said, we can't do this, because this is the Sabbath. And Ikrimah says, what are you talking about? What's this Sabbath? He says, we don't do work, we don't do anything on the Sabbath. He thinks these guys are playing us. What are you playing at? He says, what's Saturday but a day between Friday and Sunday? What are you talking about? He says, I sniff treachery here. So he goes back to Abu Sufyan. Abu Sufyan becomes completely enraged. And he asks, he says, bring Huyay, bring him over here. He brings Huyay, and Huyay explains, he says, look, the situation is on the Sabbath. We have this, as part of our Jewish faith, we don't do anything on the Sabbath. And he says, we can't fight, let's delay it another day. He says, this is treachery, He says, Huyay panics now. Huyay sees that the tide is changing. And he rushes back to Bani Qurayza. He says, please, he says to Ka'b ibn Asad, he says, please go against the Sabbath. He's like, my goodness me, this guy's got no morals. He wants to destroy us, this guy. He says, what sort of success are we going to have if we fight on the Sabbath? What sort of victory will God bring us if we fight on the Sabbath? He says, I've had enough of you. And the Huyay ibn Akhtar said, it's just basically, this is just turned completely on its head. What are we going to do about this? He says, I might as well stay with you. I'm not going back to Abu Sufyan. That guy's going to basically go for me. And so he basically consigns to his fate, and he stays with them. So look at this tactic. That who could have seen that coming? Basically, the Quraysh were basically just waiting. They just needed to launch an attack, a full assault with Bani Qurayza and the Quraysh and their allies and completely destroy them. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has a plan. And they have a plan, and Allah's plan always overcomes everyone's plan. And not only that, the Prophet ﷺ, he stands in dua now. And he asks Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant the Muslims victory. He makes his dua, Allahumma munzil al-kitab, سريع الحساب اهزم الأحزاب وزلزلهم وانصرنا عليهم. So he makes this dua. It's a famous dua. You know now, if you the masajid, there's mosques. Masajid Fatih is it called? Yeah. The mosques of victory. There's this area. There's one on the hilltop, isn't there? And they say this is where the Prophet ﷺ made dua. Was the dua, Allah knows best, was it in his tahajjud? Was he making his dua throughout a number of occasions on this night? Was it just before Maghrib? Or was it, was his dua made in tahajjud? It's probably, he made this dua on a number of occasions. And when I was in Medina last time with Dr. Mustafa Badawi, I remember him mentioning, maybe Sheikh Thaqib knows better, is that he said that, I'm sure he said that Abdullah ibn Umar, he used to go there after Asr, in that place, and make dua there. And so this was a sunnah, they made a sunnah out of this basically, that just as Allah gave them victory at the Khandaq, that Allah gives them victory in all their affairs. And so he would travel every Friday and stand there and make dua. And we know that Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, that he would go around trying to demarcate where the Prophet ﷺ had prayed throughout. And he was incredibly passionate about finding where the Prophet ﷺ did things and reenacting them. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he makes this dua against them, and he calls on Allah. In another dua, he says, Ya mujri as-sahab. He says, oh, the one who brings the clouds, basically. And basically a storm starts to occur, unlike any other night in Medina. This storm, and when it storms in Medina, they're very, very violent, because you can imagine it's sand just blowing everywhere, and they're in the city, and the Quraysh are outside the city. They say this storm was so vicious that it literally ripped their tents from the ground, and these pots were just flying in the air. And we're not talking about, this isn't like what sort of pots we're talking about? We're talking about cast iron. Have you ever picked up a cast iron like teapot? It's like you have to use both hands. And these things are flying in the air. They couldn't even keep their food cooking. The fires went out and the pots were flying in the air. This is how bad it was, the weather. And the Prophet and it's pitch black, a storm, you can't see anything. They said you couldn't hardly see your fingers in front of you. And the Prophet stands up before the Sahaba and says, who will volunteer to go and check out what's happening at the Quraysh? And no one says anything. You can imagine it. You've got the greatest of Sahaba, none of them. And when Hudayfa ibn Yaman, he relates this hadith, because he gets selected by the Prophet ﷺ. He narrated this in Iraq, and there was these young Muslim students around, and says, if we had been around the Prophet ﷺ, you would have seen what we would have done. We would have shown you, we would have showed our strength. And Hudayfa said, he says, you don't realise what was going on. That was a ferocious night. We saw nothing like it. There's Sidna Abu Bakr, Sidna Umar, everybody, but no one stood up to volunteer that night. It was freezing, the wind was vicious, and you couldn't even see your own hands in front of you. And the Prophet ﷺ cries out 3 times, who will volunteer? And the Prophet ﷺ, no one. And the Prophet ﷺ then says, Hudayfa, stand up. Oh my goodness me. But there was a huge wisdom why the Prophet ﷺ selected Hudayfa, because Hudayfa had never participated in the Battle of Badr. Him and his father didn't participate in the Battle of Badr. Why? Because they had made a promise with the Quraysh. They were travelling at the time, and the Quraysh caught them, and they were nearly going to kill them. And then they made them promise they wouldn't fight with the Muslims against them. They didn't know they were Muslims, but they said they knew they were travelling to Medina. He says, you're not allowed to fight with us. And the Prophet ﷺ made them honour that promise. So that there's a huge wisdom in that Muslims have to hold to their promises. So there's no treachery in Islam. As I said, there's deception, but not treachery. The Prophet didn't let them see. He went out for Uhud and came back late and wasn't able to participate in Uhud. So there's a huge reason why he chose him, because the Quraysh would not recognise him. The Quraysh had hardly ever seen him. He wasn't originally from Medina. He wasn't from Quraysh. And so the Prophet sends him out there. He goes, and he's never seen Abu Sufyan, but he says, this must be Abu Sufyan, because he spots Abu Sufyan. He gathers the Quraysh. He says, is anyone in his tent, is anyone here present right now, it's pitch black, not from the Quraysh? He says, grab the person's hand, check with the person next to you who he is. And so Hudayfa instantaneously grabs the hand of the one guy and says, who are you? guy says, I'm so-and-so. He grabs up and goes, who are you? He says, I'm so-and-so. And because he did that, they didn't ask who he was. So he was instantaneously, this was a genius of him. And so they don't even know he's present. And Abu Sufyan says, look, I've had enough. I don't know what you guys are doing, but I'm getting out of here. He says, this is purposeless. Nothing's going to come of this. We're going to leave now and just get out of here. And so they decide to do that. Hudayfa ibn Yamam, he says, I had 2 opportunities to actually shoot him with my arrow. I could have killed Abu Sufyan, done and dusted. But the Prophet ﷺ said, do not expose us. And so he had the words of the Prophet ﷺ on his mind. And he chose, obviously, to obey the Prophet ﷺ, not go against his order. And so Hudayfa, he gets news of what the Quraysh are doing. He rushes back, and as he rushes back, he sees, to the best of my knowledge, about 20 horsemen with their faces covered, rushing towards the camp of the Quraysh. And they said, tell your companion, the Prophet ﷺ, that we have sufficed him from this army. Who were those people on horseback? Any ideas? They were angels that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent in order to protect them with the winds and the forces. The Prophet ﷺ made dua. Now his dua was being accepted. All these forces coming against the Quraysh to discourage them from attacking the Muslims. Sorry, I forgot to mention that when Hudayfa actually, he says, whoever goes and does this mission for me tonight, I will be his companion. He'll be next to me on the day of judgment, on the day of standing. So this was a huge reward for Hudayfa ibn Yaman. And so now we see that the Quraysh, they had completely left, and the Prophet ﷺ, he said about this, he says, Al-an naghzu wa la yughza alayna. He says, from now on, we will attack and we will never be attacked. This was a prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ. This came to pass. After this, the Muslims were now in the front seat, basically. They were the force to be dealt with in Arabia. And they didn't even fight, if you think about it. But what was it they were really rewarded for? It was their patience and being steadfast and forbearing in the time of tribulation, and just holding on and being patient and knowing and finding out what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do for them. And when you do that, when you have firm belief that everything will work out for its best, that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends you forces from whence you never even reckoned. And so this is one of the major lessons from the Battle of the Trench, is that when you've got no trick left in the book, basically you hold fast, because in our life Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never let us down as long as we keep pushing forward and we keep firm faith. That's the most important thing in our life. When we haven't got a ruse left, a trick left in the book, we turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant us victory from whence we never even expected. And there are many, many great, obviously the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and he's about to come when the Prophet ﷺ goes to perform the Umrah. Amazing things are now going to open up for the Muslims after this huge tribulation that afflicted them. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable us to benefit from these lessons, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to instill more love of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to put him before our own selves. So we saw Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and Jabir ibn Abdullah, they put the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam before themselves. And when you put the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam before yourself, he puts you before himself. That's what we've learned from this. When we put the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam before ourselves, he puts you before his own self on the day of judgment. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be there for us to suffice us and protect us. Subhana rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun alal mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. So I've gone a bit over.
Sheikh Idris, mashallah ta'ala. Alhamdulillah, in these continuation classes are for us to be in a state in which the hudur of the presence of the Prophet is with us at every moment. Every moment and period we pass through our lives, in which we have had the highs and lows of life, at times of tribulation, at times of ease, and times of joy, and times of sorrow. All of these moments are in which the Prophet and companions themselves pass through. And it's time for us to reflect upon these incidents, and this is the history of the Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. So only through the Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ will we understand the reflections and the understandings of the attributes of Allah as is possible for a human being to be reflected upon, that is the Prophet ﷺ. So Allah give us tawfiq, inshaAllah, to continue for these classes and to see how the tribulation started with the Prophet ﷺ before the wiladah, how they continued throughout the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and thereafter the great and glorious futuhat came upon the Prophet and the Muslims thereafter at the final point of the seerah, inshallah, which will then continue. The next class, inshallah, will be upon the incident of Banu Qurayza, which is a very, very important incident for many different reasons, because as we know, incident in which the treacherous Jews of Banu Qurayza, how they were dealt with by the Prophet ﷺ. And we may have read many of the historical reports regarding this incident, but alhamdulillah, seerah is a living, and it's a subject, and it's a discipline which is continuously in a state of research, continuously in a state of growth, and continuously in a state of revision almost. And alhamdulillah, scholars have written in this period, particularly in the Banu Qurayza, great works, inshallah, which will help to look at in the next coming class, inshallah. But before that, we ask Sheikh Idris, inshallah, to bless us maybe with some moments where we can take questions from the Majma', inshallah. So, if anybody has any questions, please, this is your moment to ask. There's some time to allow to ask a question, inshallah.
I was wondering if you'd heard about this question of both the new seerah book, Miraj Muhammad, Revelation. It was written by a doctor, so he's not a qualified scholar, but he's done an incredible pedagogical job in terms of research and things. I was just wondering how recommended is it, or are there aspects which we should be careful about?
Have you heard of this work?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. As you know, alhamdulillah, every science has its ikhtisas, and seerah, like every other science, is also a discipline within our deen. And within the deen, there are aimah of the science of seerah which we have, and also the ulama of tarjih within the science also. And alhamdulillah, in this contribution, the book The Revelation, as it's called, yes, alhamdulillah, yes, it has lots of positive aspects in which he systematically mentions some of the incidents, and also the colourful way which the science of seerah is presented. However, as you know, the author himself, and that is his own claim, mostly taken from the present English sources. The present English sources in the science of seerah, as you know, they are very few in comparison to the wealth and the great treasures that we have in the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. And as you know, Mawahib al-Dunya and the sharh upon it, these works, and the sharh of Suhaili upon the Hisham, and the Ishaq, obviously, all of these works have commentaries upon them, and they have marginal notes upon them. So the science of seerah is not as simple as what we have from the works that we have present in the English language. So therefore, some of the work, and we've seen, is very linear in terms of what's already available in English language, compiled together into one work. Alhamdulillah, it's not without benefit. I'm not saying that, alhamdulillah, but some of the instances mentioned, especially about Fath Makkah, what's found inside the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, also about Banu Qurayza. There's different opinions on these that also need to be looked at, which some of the Arab works will inshallah give you. So alhamdulillah, it's a beneficial work which we can benefit from, inshallah, but it's not the final word on the seerah, also the incidents mentioned within it. Wallahu ta'ala.
Is it a large work?
It's like a textbook in like a textbook format.
When did that come out?
It's fairly recent. Just one of the benefits is that he was a student of Sheikh Hamza's class, and I think he's a brain surgeon. He's very intelligent. And Sheikh Hamza once said, if someone can write down the names of all these tribes and things, it would be really useful. And so he took that to heart, and he wrote down all the names, and it became a massive project. Took him years, and he developed a system to help, like an index, and it developed into seerah. So one of the interesting things is some really good mnemonics and ways to memorize events in the seerah. That's what I found personally.
So it's more of an educational.
Yeah, it's like a textbook. Yeah.
Any other questions? Your name is?
I'm Osman.
Osman.
Question is not on the incident of Khandaq, but the idea of Khandaq was brought from Salman al-Farsi, and from there one analyzes that his story was that he had come attached to different monks,
Yes.
And the monks all told him an event would come of a prophet in Yathrib. Do we know much about the science or whatever background there is of the monks? Because that to me seems to show the true message of Islam being passed on to monks of a prophet who would arise in Jah. Is there anything more about that kind of detail?
All I heard mentioned from the scholars is that the last monk, he says, "What I don't know anyone else that is upon what I'm upon." So what we understand from these monks were that they were on a specific kind of faith of Christianity that was not in line with what the predominant positions of the Christian Church. And so what we understand from this is probably more of a monotheistic, belief in one God, and the seeing Jesus Christ salam as more as a prophet rather than the Son of God. That's what I can ascertain from the sources. But other than that, I don't think we know too much. Do you know anything? Does that answer your question as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not aware of anyone speaking about. Other than that, they did mention, I remember that specifically, is that they want something different to what was the dominant practice of
So the last monk said that other than him, not anyone else.
Yes.
Which then implies that the teaching of Islam as it was originally in its original form was not in that.
Yeah, it was perverted. Yes.
Perverted.
And I mean, and that's we obviously see that those very, very early Christian. I'm not an expert in Christianity, but there's very, very, as I said, they had the very, very early denominations of the Christian Church. They had very different views, and I said obviously we know with the treaty of Nicaea, is that was 300 years after. There was still a lot of debate about the qualities of Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam, and so it was, it took them that long for them to really just come together to agree on the basics of their creed, and it was a very contentious issue, and there was a lot of difference of opinion, array of opinions about the nature of Christ, and so we know that that even in those days there was a lot of conflicting opinion, and so from amongst them would have been probably the pristine understanding, the true understanding of Jesus Christ's nature and salam. There would have been a group from amongst them, but they died out. Okay. Are the Dead Sea Scrolls and all these others, the parchments that were discovered, do we have any parchments that seem to talk about, that seem to address these issues of the original? I'm not as best on that. I know that Dr. Ali Adai, this is his expertise really. He worked for the Zaytun Institute, that's his expertise, so it's not my expertise. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Assalamualaikum. What were the dimensions of the ditch, like depth and breadth?
I've got them actually. So the trench was around 2 kilometres long, so it's like 1 mile and 1.24 miles. There's a range of opinions about this, but this seems the strongest opinion. It's 13 feet wide approximately, and around 7 to 9 adhra depth. And so the dhira is like half a metre. So we're looking at about 4 to 4.5 metres in depth. So that's what I got on that.
So what was like the military positioning? Like, did they have like archers on the back, or like?
I don't think they would have had alarms, but they were actually within the trenches, I think, with spears to the best of my knowledge, to prevent the trying to jump over. Do you have any more information on that?
There were some areas of the trench which were lower than the others, and that region which was said to be dug on came before they expected and they're complete. But those areas are more heavily fortified. Were
they the areas that Ikrimah wrote to?
First scaled over the
Do you know anything about Hazrat Salman, how he ended up into slavery?
Yes, we know that because remember that Salman Farisi radiallahu anhu, he was told by the last monk that the final prophet would appear, and he would appear in the land of date palms. So he knew that it must be in Arabia, and so he met with a caravan of Arabs and said, would you take me to this place? And so they agreed to take him to Arabia, but when they took him, they were treacherous, and they actually sold him to slavery. And he was bought by a Jew from, I think initially from Khaybar, was it Khaybar? Yeah, he was sold into slavery at Khaybar, and then that Jew had a relative, cousin or so forth, that was in Medina, and he bought him off him, and so that's how he ended up in Medina. Any other questions? It's a pleasure to meet you all here in Leicester anyway. Inshallah, it's the first but not the last. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك عملنا سوء وظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا لنكونن من الخاسرين. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is coming together for your sake, this recitation and this study of the Seerah of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala you put in the record of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, his family, his companions, and the two blessed generations that came after, and the record of all your righteous and noble servants that call people to your way and guide people to your way from the beginning of time to the end of time as a gift from us to our superiors. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala any intention that the Institute has behind these, ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to fill it for them. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala you bless Sheikh Zakir and all the people that are the means behind this Institute and these lessons, these educational lessons. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala you reward them higher than their highest expectations. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you reward them beyond their expectations and they see the rewards of that in the next life. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless them and may they be a benefit for all the community and the community be a benefit for them. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala we see the fruits of this learning within our communities. You enable us to bring about a change in our life and the change of our loved ones around us and the communities around us as well. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala none of us leave this gathering so that all our sins are forgiven, all our worries and woes removed, all our debts are cleared, and all our needs in this life and the next are fulfilled. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala you give us a firm footing upon the path. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala you keep us steadfast in our religion. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala you give us understanding in our religion. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala you open up, you give us awareness to our own faults and the means in which to draw closer to you. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us ability and awareness and able to work on ourselves and draw closer to you and bring about profound change in our lives and change the life of the people around us and we love. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala you bless us and bless our loved ones and bless our parents and bless our spouses and our children, our immediate families and extended families. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon this ummah, rectify the state of this ummah, conceal the faults of this ummah and be there for this ummah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the Muslims that are suffering around the world, Allah alleviate their suffering. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala those who have lost loved ones, Allah replace their sorrow with happiness and joy. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala those who are being oppressed, Allah give them victory over their oppressors. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that anyone who has a need in their heart tonight, Allah will feel that for them. If anyone's sick or knows someone who is sick, Allah give them a quick and speedy recovery and bring them back to sound health. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala anyone who's passed away from the community, may all this barakah be recorded in their record to raise their stations in the next life and forgive them their shortcomings in this life. May we all die in a full state of Iman. Allah's word being La ilaha illallah, Sayyidina Muhammad Rasulullah. We live it, we breathe upon it, and we die upon it, and we're raised in the company of the one that brought it to us, Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. On that day he be there for us, on that day he beckons us forward and enables us to drink from his past and blessed and double hand and drink that we never thirst from ever again. On that day he take us, on that day he embrace us, on that day he hold us by the hand and enter us into paradise without any reckoning or trial or test. And we be forever, we be together, all of us, in the highest stations of paradise, in his company, gazing upon your countenance for eternity and beyond, and that's not difficult for you, Ya Allah. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun, wa salamun ala al-mursaleen, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Allah bless you all. Thank you very much. We've got Sulaiman, we've got Muhammad there. MashaAllah, he hides it when he's the teacher of. MashaAllah. That's Sulaiman.